Okay, so one thing the First World War did do was revolutionize aviation and warfare in general because of the use of aviation and tanks. Even though the planes in the First World War and the tanks didn't have the kind of impact they will in the Second, they were still rudimentary. So aviation had been around before the war, but it was the war that really accelerated it. The militaries of all the belligerents did have aircraft in their in service prior to the war, but this really and they had been used. For example, Italy used some planes, but in some conflicts in the earlier 19 teens. But this really pushed it forward to be something much bigger. Uh, Both phenomena created air forces and tank forces. Um, Most of the military leadership did understand the potential for what aviation could do. Obviously, it gives you eyes. You can see much further, and so balloons had been used for reconnaissance going back more than 100 years, but a plane could move much more quickly. A balloon can't move very quickly. And then once you see the other your opposing military force is trying to look at you, then you want to try to stop them from looking at you, and so then you try to shoot down their planes or do that. And so the interrupter gear synchronization of the machine gun going through the propellers uh, that revolutionized planes, making the plane itself into a weapon. And pretty soon they started mounting things like rockets to the wings and firing those. And in the First World War, that was rudimentary. In the Second World War, that got much more advanced. You'd have planes that specialized in different things. So bombers were developed. The Germans developed bombing pretty early, and the planes, the engines weren't powerful enough to carry a lot of heavy bombs, but they did make bigger planes that would drop bombs on the enemy or sometimes on civilians. In some cases, that would result in tragic consequences. For example, a French raid on the city of Karlsruhe in Germany, a French bombing raid, inadvertently bombed a circus and killed 154 children in German children, which was considered an atrocity. So bombing did advance. So the Germans kind of started bombing with the Zeppelins, but then started making bomber aircraft, and then the French and British followed suit. The tank, unlike the airplane, came out of nowhere. The tank was invented for the war. Um, Winston Churchill was actually someone involved in the development of it. He had been impressed by armored cars early in the war, and he envisioned some kind of a trench spanning machine that would operate kind of like a ship on the ground, like a wheeled gun platform. The way the battleships were basically floating gun platforms, the tank would be basically a vehicle to carry a gun and bring that fire to the enemy. So the British started developing these in 1915, what they called the prototype land ships, and they got the first working one in January 1916, which looked something like this. This is a German Mark, or excuse me, a British Mark One tank, and it was a big, lumbering, slow thing. It weighed 28 tons and under optimum conditions could operate at a top speed of 4 miles an hour. So these things weren't that effective, and the British rolled them out in 1917, hoping that they would turn the tide on the front. And they did. When the British first unleashed their tanks, like the Mark III, Mark IV tanks on the German lines, it was indeed shocking to the Germans to see this wagon on tracks that could indeed span the trenches and protect the people inside from a lot of the shrapnel. They were so slow that they were vulnerable to direct artillery fire, but machine gun fire wouldn't do much to them. They were armored enough for that, and shrapnel it wouldn't hurt the people inside. But if you could directly land a big shell on it, these things would stop. They would get broken, or the armor could be pierced. But against just rifle fire, machine gun fire, smaller machine gun fire, smaller caliber, and against artillery fire that's not directly landing on you, it's obviously much tougher than flesh and bone. And the Germans did, like, when they first saw them, they ran like crazy, afraid of them, but pretty quickly figured out, okay, these are slow lumbering things. They're so slow that if you can get a soldier close enough, he can, like, just bomb it, throw a grenade on it, and bomb it himself. They needed a lot of support, and they were so slow that the infantry would just walk next to them and kind of use them as a shield against the fire. And they were called different things. It was that there were different names to try to keep them secret, and so they were actually they were transported to the front under tarps, and so the air reconnaissance couldn't see what they are, and they said that they were special water carriers that were bound for Russia, and so that's why they got the name tank. But the actual name before tank, they had wanted to call them land ships, but that gave away what they were, and also considered calling them reservoirs or cisterns. But they got the name tanks because they had pretended that these were water tanks that they were going to ship to Russia when they were in actuality a kind of armored vehicle, or fighting vehicle. In any case, neither the air war nor the tank war changed the course of the fighting, really. It was still mostly an infantry war, and but these things did, the militaries took these things seriously. The aircraft did have somewhat of an effect. The bombing had a very serious psychological effect, if not a big tactical impact. And the tanks did as well. And this was the beginning of what we become much bigger enterprise in the future. For the planes, again, they were psychological in the damage they could do. They were also psychological in the heroes they could produce. So the fighter aces, for example, who would patrol the skies looking to shoot down reconnaissance planes or other fighter planes or bombers or whatnot, those aces, you gave an ace if you got more than 5 confirmed victories. They became these heroes the newspapers would talk about, and these were individual acts of heroics that could be celebrated in a war that had mass casualties and mass death. In these cases, you could celebrate the individual accomplishments of these folks. And so the Germany had the Red Baron and all this, and some of them would paint their planes in order to be more distinctive. They weren't so concerned about camouflage or whatever. If your plane went down, you were probably dead. The goal was to not go down, not crash your plane in enemy territories either. If you did somehow survive the crash, which it was hard to survive a crash in these rickety things that were made out of wood and canvas and wire, with an engine on it and a machine gun. But as a result, the fighter aces deserved to be recognized because it was extremely dangerous just to get in one of these things. I mean, the engines would fail. The wind, they were so light, the wind could blow them the wrong way, and that would mess up the avionics, and they would crash, and landing them was always questionable. So a lot of the Air Force pilots, or in the various Air Forces, they died in high numbers. Casualty rate was quite high. But by 1918, it became clear these were aircraft were serious military weapons. You could use them, and they're relatively low cost. You could use them to kill much larger things. In 1918, it became clear you could bomb a battleship, and a small craft with a relatively low cost could destroy this huge ship. Again, all those resources in those naval vessels. So this was going to become a much bigger deal going forward. And even in the interim, it was a fairly big deal.